This is Mike Tatarsky, host of the Vietnam Weekly podcast and author of the Vietnam Weekly newsletter, coming to you from Ho Chi Minh City. Today's episode is essentially an emergency episode in response to the reciprocal tariffs imposed by U.S. President Donald Trump overnight Vietnam time, with a rate of 46% on Vietnamese imports to the U.S., one of the highest rates of any country, and I believe the highest among major trading partners. There's still a lot to digest here, and a lot could change. So I'm adding some caveats ahead of time for this conversation with returning guest Kyle Freeman, a partner at Dezen Shira and Associates. He was on the podcast a couple of months ago for an episode about Vietnam's standing in Trump's trade rhetoric at the time. And at the time, it appeared quite positive. Vietnam hadn't been mentioned at all. In the ensuing weeks and months, Vietnam took many steps to preemptively kind of preempt tariffs, apparently none of which worked. So again, caveat that a lot could still change. These tariffs don't go into effect, importantly, until next week. So there is time for Vietnam to negotiate, or at least attempt to negotiate. So, again, caveat that some of this could change by the time you listen to it, but I wanted to get a quick reaction from Kyle, who's really sharp on this, and I know a lot of people are interested and concerned about this topic. I think there's a lot of shock in Vietnam at the moment, so let's get to my conversation with Kyle. Kyle, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast, especially last minute.
Sure, no problem. I think we have a lot to discuss, so glad to join.
Yeah, and again, I already mentioned this in the intro, but we'll add the caveat that a lot could change. This is kind of an initial reaction. I'm sure a lot will change, but we wanted to get some initial thoughts down. So I guess we'll just start big picture. What exactly did President Trump announce in terms of reciprocal tariffs for Vietnam?
So Trump announced a two-part tariff plan. There is a 10% baseline tariff on all imports going into the U.S., and then there are higher reciprocal tariff rates on about 20 or so other countries. So Vietnam is one of those countries with the higher reciprocal tariff rate of 46% being announced and potentially being applied on all goods the U.S. imports from Vietnam. Of the tariffs announced, or of the reciprocal tariffs announced, Vietnam would have the second highest reciprocal tariff rate applied to its goods, only after the 49% applied to Cambodia. The 10% baseline tariffs go into effect on April 5th, and the higher reciprocal tariff rates would go into effect on April 9th. And these tariffs would be applied on top of any existing tariffs.
Okay. And is it clear? So that would be, excuse me, 46% on top of 10% as well?
It's not clear at the moment, but it looks like it would be 46%. And then if there were any existing tariffs before that 46%, then it would be applied on top of those. For instance, the China example, China has, just taking the Trump 2.0 tariffs, there were 20% tariffs applied in Trump's second term already to China, and then China has a reciprocal tariff rate of, I believe it's 34%. So that would be 34% plus 20%, adding up to about 54% for China.
Yes, obviously this is significant, putting it mildly, for Vietnam. The U.S. is the country's largest export market, especially in sectors like furniture and apparel, things like that, electronics as well. Now, I've seen some more reporting since I first sent you these questions, but do we have an idea of where this 46% came from? I mean, I think it's the sense I've gotten is that this came as a shock for people here in Vietnam.
Yeah, so the tariffs were obviously not a one-to-one matching of a country's tariffs, or the difference between a country's tariffs and the U.S. tariff rates. So take Vietnam, for example. Vietnam's average tariff for all goods on an MFN basis is about 9.4%. And using the same calculation, the U.S.'s average tariff on all goods is about 3.3%. If we look at average tariffs on an MFN weighted basis, Vietnam's tariffs on U.S. goods alone are actually lower than the US's tariffs on Vietnamese goods. Um, so for the announcement that came out, the Trump administration said the reciprocal tariffs would not just consider tariff rates, but also non tariff barriers, which are a bit more difficult to quantify. The U.S. Trade Representative has a fairly complex explanation of how they got to these tariff rates. It has some integers and Greek letters in there of how the reciprocal tariff rates were calculated. But it looks like the Trump administration just did a very basic calculation to get these tariffs. And they just divided the U.S. trade deficit with a country by the U.S.'s total imports from that country to get what they've called that country's tariff rate. And then they've divided that by two, and that's the reciprocal tariff rate that we get. So we can assume that they feel these two data points capture all that needs to be considered about a country's tariffs and non tariff barriers, which seems to be somewhat of an oversimplification of how bilateral trade works.
Yeah, I mean they're basically equating, if this is accurate, trade as a tariff, like total trade as a tariff. Which I'm not an economist, but I've certainly never seen that before.
They've cited some research papers, but I've never seen this actually applied to tariff rates.
And then again, I think I've noticed some, or not some, definitely a shock here in Vietnam. I've got friends, my wife as well, who work in manufacturing here, and they are not happy, to put it mildly. But at the same time, Vietnam, the government was quite proactive over the last couple of months. I mean, there were clear concerns. The Vietnam's trade surplus, other issues were quite well known. But there's been high level meetings. The trade minister went to Washington and talked about buying more U.S. goods. The government kind of rammed through this approval of Starlink, which is owned by SpaceX. So, one of Elon Musk's companies. There's been talk of quickly approving the Trump Organization golf course resort complex up north, maybe with even more projects later on. And all of these steps, I mean, I don't think the government quite said it, but clearly were done with the concern of potential tariffs looming overhead. So what do you make of this kind of shocking tariff rate, even with all of that done in advance?
Yeah, Vietnam was one of the more active countries in attempting to engage the Trump administration before tariffs were announced. So you ran through a list there. There was Vietnam's trade minister recently visiting the U.S. for working level meetings with the U.S. trade representative. There were a number of primarily energy deals signed as part of that trip where Vietnam agreed to purchase energy products from the U.S. Vietnam also announced lower tariff rates on a number of energy products shortly after those deals. And then you mentioned Vietnam also approved a pilot program for Starlink, which Elon Musk is the majority owner of, and promised to expedite a Trump Organization project in Vietnam that's worth about $15 billion. So I'm not sure if the tariff announcement will change Vietnam's plans, but Vietnam has previously said it's willing to engage with the U.S. on lowering the trade deficit, which we just mentioned was part of the calculation for the tariff rates and discussions around tariffs. So I think we'll have to wait and see what the reaction is and how this may progress.
Yeah, I'm certainly, like everybody, interested to see what the reaction is. I haven't seen anything official yet, I guess. I know I've seen a few domestic media articles about some manufacturing associations are obviously worried, and I think calling meetings to figure out what's going on. So we shall see. But I guess what I know, you've had a busy morning, as you mentioned. But what are you kind of hearing from your network? And I guess what would you maybe advise, manufacturers or investors operating in Vietnam who are clearly worried?
Yeah, so there's a lot of, I think, moving parts here. I think the first thing is probably to take a breath and let's see if and how this moves forward. These could being optimistic, these could potentially be rolled back. For one, Trump could change his mind on the implementation. We've seen this with other Trump 2.0 tariffs. The U.S. could also grant a grace period for countries to negotiate or address concerns, or the U.S. Congress might vote to block the economic emergency that Trump declared. So, Trump, I believe we talked about this in the previous podcast, uh, but Trump has declared, or Trump is using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, as the legal basis for tariffs. So if Congress declares that there votes to declare that there is no economic emergency, this could potentially delay or void the tariffs. With that said, I think companies should see what their exposure is here and what potential tariff structuring or diversification options they might have moving forward. Again, this is still a fluid situation. Like I said, we need to see how this will be implemented on the US side, but also if there will be any retaliatory tariffs that may change or escalate the situation.
And I guess, I mean, again, we can't predict the future, and this is very fluid. But if, God forbid, worse comes to worse, and this 46% really goes into effect and like sticks around for a while, what could the potential impact be? I mean, obviously, one of the big impacts of Trump's first term's trade war against China specifically was Vietnam's, ongoing boom in manufacturing, which these rates, I guess, really put at risk. I mean, I noticed countries like Indonesia, the reciprocal rate was a bit lower. Same for Malaysia, I think. I think those are a couple of pretty big regional competitors. I guess further afield, maybe India. But if, again, we hope this doesn't happen, but if this kind of sticks, what could that mean potentially in the medium or longer term?
Yeah, this will be interesting to see how this plays out. The Trump administration has expressly noted the point of these tariffs are to move manufacturing back to the US. That's going to take some time. And you noted competitors for Vietnam or countries that produce the same types of goods that Vietnam produces. A number of these countries also have higher reciprocal tariff rates that would be applied. Those rates are not as high as the rate that would be applied to Vietnam, but a number of them also do have fairly high rates as well.
Yeah, we will see about that. Well, anyway, I think I don't know. Is there anything? Oh, I think I meant to kind of include this in the first question, but do we know if there's any carve outs or exclusions in the initial announcement? Not just Vietnam specifically, but kind of for this tariff plan overall.
So far, it looks like there's not any carve outs or exclusions.
Okay. Well, yeah. Anyway, I think that's a good initial reaction. Again, as we both noted, this is very fluid. A lot may change in the time it takes me to post this online, so we will see. But I really appreciate, Kyle, appreciate you taking time out of your very busy morning to share some initial thoughts. And obviously, we'll all be paying very close attention to this. So yeah, I appreciate it again.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me, Mike. Always good speaking with you.
That's it for this episode of the Vietnam Weekly podcast. I'm taking Monday off for the Hung Kings holiday. Find the podcast on any podcast platform and please rate or review it. That helps other people find it. And I'll see you in a couple of weeks.